It's horrible to get internet.
Can imagine.
Very frustrating.
Yes. Yes, in Rotterdam, I was used to use internet everywhere, and now I came here and say, "Oh, come on."
Okay, so I think that we can begin, at least with the introductions. So I guess welcome everybody to this new session of the YSI History of Economics Working Group. We will have two sessions today. So after this session, we will have another session with Emanuele Chitera and David Colander. But in this first session, we have Nicolas, who is in Argentina, but who is a master's student at the University of Rotterdam. And as a discussant, we have Michel Debroy, emeritus professor from the L'Université Catholique de Louvain. So, Nicolas, you will have 20 minutes to discuss your paper, to present your paper. Then Michel will talk for 20 more minutes, and then we will have we'll open the floor for questions from the rest of the audience. I have muted the rest of the audience for the duration of the presentations, but if you want to make a question after Michel's comments, then you can make it live, or you can write it on the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen, and I will read it out loud if you want to. Hi, Tiago. How are you? So we can begin then. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Juan, and thank you, Michael. Now, I will try to share. Are you watching my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Because I'm not watching you, but I suppose that all of you are watching me. So, hello, everyone. I'm Nicolas Berneman. I'm a master student at EIPE, Rotterdam. Now I'm in Argentina for some time, but I spent my 2 years there in Rotterdam studying philosophy and economics. So maybe my Spanish accent is because I've been in Argentina for 3 months already. Okay. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. The paper that I will present is called On the Gap Between Economic Theory and Economic Policy Making, a methodological and historical account. And this presentation has like 4 sections. First, I will introduce the paper. Then I will talk about Mankiw's account. Then I will talk about methodological account, and then I will share some conclusions. So let's go with the introduction. I start with the problem, which I look with concern, which is that I see that macroeconomics has like 2 well-developed fields, but with low integration. Like on the one hand, we have economic theory, which is developed through economic models and abstraction and all of that. And on the other hand, we have economic policy making. And when we see, for instance, Blau's description, he said that, for instance, modern economics is sick. Economics has increasingly become an intellectual game played for its own sake and not for its practical consequences. Economists have gradually converted the subject into a sort of social mathematics in which analytical rigor, as understood in math department, is everything and relevance is nothing. And then not only Blau, but then we see Mankiw, for instance, and he only says that the sad truth is that the macroeconomic research of the past 3 decades has had only a minor impact on the practical analysis of monetary or fiscal policy, and the research might have been successful as a matter of science, but it has not contributed significantly to macroeconomic engineering. And this was a problem which I observed when I was studying economics and also the rest of my life, and I was looking this with a lot of concern. And to explain how can we explain this gap between theory and practice in macroeconomics. And when I was studying, also there is a paper of Mankiw which is called "The Macroeconomist as Scientist and Engineer," where he tries to explain this phenomenon. And he claims that this phenomenon is a consequence of the triumph of the new classic scientist spirit over Keynesian engineering one. So there is this approach by Mankiw. I'm not sure if someone reads this paper, but it's interesting, but I think it's a bit inaccurate. So my main concern first was to criticize this paper, because I found it very vague, a lot of his appreciation. And so my first idea is to criticize it, and then I will try to give another explanation, which is in methodological terms. I will explain these two claims afterwards, but mainly my presentation has two aspects. First, I will criticize Mankiw. I will introduce it and criticize, and then I will propose another explanation for this phenomenon that we can follow. So I will start with Mankiw, and when we see Mankiw, maybe we can summarize Mankiw in these terms. He claims that the triumph of the new classic scientific approach over the Keynesian engineering is the main reason why economics has become excessively formal, mathematized, and disconnected from practical goals. I made a kind of description of his account in 6 premises. First, I said that there is 2 main schools of economics: macroeconomics, neoclassic, and Keynesian. Mankiw says that. Then he says that the history of macroeconomics has evolved through a tension between those schools. Then he says that while Keynesian has mainly an engineering character, neoclassics has mainly a scientific one. Then he said that on the 17th there was a big success of neoclassics over Keynesians. Afterwards, he claimed that because of that, economics has become theory-oriented instead of policy-oriented. And finally, he concluded that there is a gap between economic theory and economic policymaking. My main concern is that premise 3, that claims that while Keynesian has mainly an engineering character, neoclassic has mainly scientific one. And I think that maybe it sounds interesting and provocative, but I think that is mistaken and is misguided. So, well, this is Mankiw's, in Mankiw's words, it's like the division of economics between neoclassic and new Keynesian is not between the political right or the political left, but to a greater extent, it's a split between pure scientists and economic engineers. So we have Keynesians who have an engineering approach, and we have neoclassics that have a scientific approach. In his view, Keynesians are economists who have the purpose to intervene. By contrast, neoclassics are economists who have the purpose of understand. Furthermore, Keynesians are primarily concerned with the practical application of economic theory, while neoclassics fundamentally concerned with the rigor and elegance of the theory. I think it sounds, again, interesting, but when you see which are the explanation behind these claims, I think that Mankiw has not arguments or not proper arguments or not proper support to this claim. And when you go deep in the paper, you only see examples. He says, for instance, Keynesians like Tobin, Solow, when you see them, they work at the Council of Economic Advisors. So there you can see that Keynesians were motivated by problems in the real world, and they are used to apply their theories. And Mankiw says that it's the same case when you see new Keynesians, for instance, Fisher, Summers, Stiglitz, or Bernanke, or Mankiw himself. You see that all these new Keynesians left academia to engage in the public policy. So he says that it is remarkable that the new Keynesians were, by temperament, more inclined to become macroeconomics engineers than were economists working in the new classic tradition. And then he doesn't explain a lot about new classic scientific approach. He only says that new classic are Friedman. For the main characters are Friedman, Lucas and Sargent, Kendall and Prescott. He only complained a bit about Lucas, and that Lucas is working a fantastic world that's very unreal and all of that. He says that as a result of these three waves or new classic economics, the monetarism, rational expectation, and real business cycle, the field of macroeconomics became increasingly rigorous and increasingly tied to tools of macroeconomics. So my critique is that premise 3 is unfounded, that it is fallacious to characterize both Keynesian as engineers, and also it's mistaken to characterize new classic as pure scientists. First, I claim that Keynesians characterize Keynesians as engineers is mistaken, and indeed Keynesians, there are a lot of heterogeneity within Keynesians, and as well Keynesians provide a lot of important, significant theoretical contributions. Heterogeneity is well known in the paper in which Leijonhufvud, I don't know how to pronounce his name, he distinguished between Keynesian economics and the economics of Keynes. And indeed, he says that Keynes himself cannot be seen as in between Keynesian economists, and these two groups are doing different stuff, and they understand Keynesianism in different ways. They understand economic theory in different ways. So some of them try to reconcile Keynes with the classical theory, and the others believe that what Keynes was doing is to challenge orthodox price theory. So my point is that there are a lot of theoretical discussion, and there are a lot of character inside Keynesianism, and it's so hard to characterize all of them as engineering, but there is a very rich theoretical discussions inside. Regarding theoretical contributions, I will not explain all the contributions of Samuelson, Higgs, and all of them, but I like a quote of Skidelsky, who claims that Keynes understood that his theory had to be usable for politicians and administrations, easily apply, offering political dividends, but he also understood that before he could win the political argument, he had to win the intellectual argument. So I think it's clear that Keynes was completely relevant and a matter of science. I criticize new classics. I say that they are mistaken, and it's mistaken to characterize new classic as scientists, because when you see the goal of most new classic was the same goal as the Keynesian, which is to provide scientific basis for evaluating the effects of political alternative economic policies. It doesn't matter. Here, I say their goal was precisely the same as the Keynesian economists, to provide a scientific basis for evaluating the effect of potential alternatives. And indeed, when you see Friedman, I think it's clear that Friedman was really concerned, and the relation with Friedman and policymaking is straightforward, it's clear, and he was really concerned with how to apply economic knowledge. And his main book, which is Monetary History of the United States, is an extremely empirical book. So it's not true that Friedman was just concerned with theory after the war. Maybe Lucas is the main target of Mankiw, but again, his main concern was not only about the lack of consistency of macroeconomics itself, but his concern is that the policy implication of this lack of fundamentals. And when you read Lucas, you can see the same. I will not read all of that, but his point is that this theory is not useful to measure the actual consequence of alternative policies. He's clearly concerned with how to apply knowledge. So I think that two approaches of Mankiw are mistaken, but then when we are saying we can reach a question why Keynesians tend to intervene more than new classics, and I think that this question can be found, the answer can be found because of the theory implication of their theories, because under Keynesian theory, policy interventions are mostly effective, and thus Keynesians advocate to active role of the state, and by contrast, in the new classical framework, policy interventions are essentially ineffective. So I think that this is the reason why Mankiw observed this difference. So if I can summarize Mankiw, we have that Mankew's account is based on premise 3, that Keynesians has an engineering approach and new classic a scientific approach. I am criticizing this claiming that both Keynesian and neoclassicism combine scientific and engineering dimensions, and furthermore, they also share same goals. As a consequence, I claim my first claim, which is MindQ account is inappropriate to explain the gap between economic theory and economic reasoning. Okay. Now I go to my second claim, which is, okay, if MindQ is mistaken, how can we explain this gap between economic theory and economic policymaking? And I think that this gap cannot be explained by intention or the purpose of these two schools, but rather by methodological reasons, which are based in Walrasian and Marshallian approaches. I will explain this now. So my claim is that the current disconnection between theory and practice is based on the role of mathematics in economics, which derive from having adopted the Walrasian approach for over 50 years after the called formalist revolutions of the 50s. So if I can describe my account in 6 premises, like making a parallel with MindQ, I can say that there are 2 methodological approaches to macroeconomics, a Walrasian and a Marshallian approach. The history of macroeconomics has evolved through a methodological tension between those approaches. Then, while in methodologically a la Marshall, mathematics serves to empirical research. In a methodology a la Walras, rigor and internal consistency are key values by itself. Then on the 50s, there was a big success of the Walrasian approach, which is called formalist revolution. Because of that, economics has increasingly become mathematical oriented instead of purpose oriented. And as a consequence, there is a gap between theory and policymaking. A key premise again is premise 3, which is while methodological and Marshall, mathematics serves to empirical research, while in a methodology a la Walras, rigor and internal consistency are key values. But now I also need to explain a bit more about this. So the time is okay? Okay, yes. In the methodology a la Marshall versus the methodology a la Walras, this distinction is not based in Marshall and Walras itself, but rather I read that there's a lot of philosophers of economics like Hollander, De Broglie, Friedman, Huber, and a lot of them who make this distinction that they claim that there is a methodology understood like Marshall, and there is another methodology which has like Walrasian roots. And the conflict between these two views is not theoretical but methodological. Under Marshallian approach, they understand economics as a dynamic process where agents interact with each other within a given institutional framework, and the focus is on the market process. Like you have individuals who learn through a trial and error, they evaluate outcomes and exchange information and all of that. While on the Walrasian approach, they conceive of the agent as a utility maximizer, regardless the context and the institutions, and the attention is directed of the principles of efficient allocation. And here there is not a learning process, but rather there is an practitioner who allocates the resources according to an ex-ante optimal behavior. So I would like to highlight that these two approaches understand the use of mathematics in economics in a different way. In a methodology a la Marshall, mathematics serves to empirical research, while on the contrast, in a methodology a la Walras, rigor and internal consistency are key values by itself. Well, this is a bit more, I can here explain more a la Marshall, I think it's clear. Maybe you can say that under the Marshallian approach, the priority is on usefulness and relevance. And here empirical correspondence is more important than mathematical elegance. Hence, the role of mathematics is circumscribed by empirical research and practical understanding. And here there is a very nice metaphor of Marshall when he claims that when mathematics does not contribute to understand the real world, he used to burn the mathematics because the purpose is not elegance, but to be relevant to explain real phenomena. While in the methodology a la Walras, from the Walrasian standpoint, the focus is on internal consistency and rigor. Empirical work is undermined by the development of pure theory. Thus, mathematics play a crucial role in demonstrating the logical validity of the theory. So this is the contrast between these two methodologies. Now, I need to explain that in the 50s there was a big success of the Walrasian approach, and we can see this phenomenon which is called the formalist revolution. Blau called this in a paper in 2003, and he claims that the metamorphosis of economists in the late 40s and 50s is called a formalist revolution because it was marked not just by a preference, but by an absolute preference for the form of an economics argument over its content. It means like in the 50s, the form and the internal consistency of the theory and of the models and the arguments becomes more important than its content or this potential application. And when we see which was the most important piece of paper of this process of formalization, we have the paper of Arrow and Debreu, which is the existence of equilibrium for a competitive economy. We see this paper, Blau claims that if we were in maybe in the 20s or or at the beginning of the century, this paper was not important at all because it's so hard to explain why to mathematically demonstrate that there exists an equilibrium was so important. And this demonstration, that would have been secondary some decades early, was influential at that time because of this formalist revolution transformed an economic problem about the possibility of, in a real world, in a mathematical challenge. Indeed, to demonstrate this existence of equilibrium, it was a job on only mathematicians were able to do that, and maybe more economists, they were not able, they have not the tools for that. So it was more a mathematical problem than an economical problem. And the fact that this problem was so important, according to Blau, can only be understood through these formalist revolutions that took place in the 50s. And in this process, we can see the influence of the Bourbaki School of Mathematics and Economics. The Bourbakis were a mathematician school that took place in France. Maybe people in France know more than me. They were obsessed with this elegance and we can say the internal consistency of the theories and the demonstrations. We have Debreu, who was educated in this school, and when we see the theory of value of Debreu, we can see very important how he understands his work, and he says that the theory of value is treated here with the standards of rigor of the contemporary formalist school of mathematics. It may also lead to radical change of mathematical tools, in which allegiance to rigor dictates the axiomatic form of the analysis, where the theory, in the strict sense, is logically entirely disconnected from its interpretation. This idea that mathematics can be completely disconnected from its interpretations is extremely formal, extremely new for what economists was understood before. I mean, in a Marshallian tradition, it makes no sense at all to have mathematics which are totally disconnected from its interpretations. If we try to understand why this is important for economists, maybe we need to conclude that this can only be important in a framework in which to explain real world is not as important as to show the internal consistency of the theory. It means that these formalist revolutions represent the triumph of the Walrasian approach. It means that clearly, as I said before, this view is incompatible with the Marshallian approach, in which mathematics are pointless without intuitive correspondence with real world. By contrast, of course, the distinction between pure theory and its application is a central feature of the Walrasian approach. Furthermore, as I said before, the mathematical demonstration of the existence of equilibrium has a totally secondary role in Marshall, but is primary in Walras. So it's clear that in the 50s, there was a triumph of the Walrasian approach, which is called the formation revolution. And as some consequence of this dominance of the Walrasian approach after the formalist revolution, is that economics has increasingly become mathematical oriented instead of purpose oriented. And the limitation of the economic theory to understand the real world economy has been explained by Hodgson, Klammer, and many others. For instance, Hodgson claims that because mathematics has swamped the curricula in leading universities and graduate schools, students, economists are neither encouraged nor equipped to analyze real-world economies and institutions. And we can see this consequence in the culture of economics perspective, from a cultural perspective, specifically from if we observe what was going on in economic education. And here we have the famous survey made by Klammer and Colander, and they show that up to almost 70% of students consider having a knowledge of the economy as unimportant, which is extremely crazy, while the two most important abilities for economists were being smart in the sense of being good at solving problems and being excellent in mathematics. Of course, if we can intuitively observe that it's more important to understand, to have a knowledge about the economy than to be extremely good at mathematics. And I think this is something that we all economic students experience in our universities, in which we have mathematics 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we really have a lot of knowledge in mathematics, and we are perfect solving like derivate 1, 2, and mathematical problems. But then it was not clear how this contributes to understand the real world. And again, Klammer claim again the same. Students learn more about abstract economy than about real economy.
Nicolas,
so, yes.
Just a small comment. You have 5 minutes to finish up your presentation.
Perfect. Thanks. So as a summary of these methodological accounts, we have the distinction between methodology a la Marshall and a methodology a la Walras, in which in the methodology a la Marshall, mathematics serves to empirical research. By contrast, in the methodology a la Walras, real and internal consistency are key values by itself. And then on the 50s, there was a big success of the Walrasian approach. And then as a consequence, economics has increasingly become mathematical oriented instead of purpose oriented. So my second claim is precisely that the gap between economic theory and policymaking has methodological roots. And it doesn't matter this. Well, I will read it. And this is maybe the main claim. This is economics has become too formal and disconnected from real world. And in this essay, I have argued that these difficulties derive specifically from the Walrasian methodological approach and all of what I said before. So the conclusion in these last 3 minutes is that the gap between economic theory and economic policy making, and that this is a real problem that we want to explain and we were trying to explain. And I made a distinction between two explanations. First, Mankiw's teleological accounts. I'd say teleological because Mankiw put the focus like on the intention and the purpose of the economist. And I made a contrast between this account and a methodological account. I claim that Mankiw's account is misguided because he misunderstands, in my view, Keynesians and neoclassics. Or maybe he simplified these schools. By contrast, I claim that the gap between economic theory and policymaking has methodological roots, as I just said. So last comment, maybe as a corollary of all of this paper or this work, if my hypothesis is true, then the current gap between economic theory and policymaking is not based on intention of the purpose of the actors, but rather has only methodological roots. Well, this was the paper. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. And now we'll have Michel comment on the paper.
Thank you. Well, I'm very glad to participate to this discussion. It's my first participation to the online seminar, but I find it a very good initiative. I'm also glad to have the discussion of a paper like Nicolas' one, because well, nowadays there are not so many people working in the history of macro, and it's nice to have new recruits. So I read Nicolas' paper with pleasure and interest. There is definitely an enthusiastic, well-taught, well-read young economist. As for my general assessment of his paper, I would like to start with a sort of personal remark. I remember several decades ago when I was myself a young researcher, once I showed one of my papers to a friend of mine who was a straight neoclassical economist, asking for his reaction. And he told me that he was puzzled by my paper, saying, Michel, what is strange in your paper? Well, when I write a paper, the paper is centered on one main idea that I want to implement in a very systematic way. While in your paper, I find one idea per paragraph. And that's very puzzling because it means that possibly it's not really possible to elaborate on these ideas in a single paragraph. And so I took this, it was a comment, but it was also a criticism, and it took me some time to digest it. But I believe that he was right, and afterwards I tried to stick to this approach. And the suggestion that I would like to make from an old researcher to a young researcher is that maybe you have something to learn from that, because there's so much in your paper. And it suffers, I believe, from the very flaw that my friend noticed in my paper. So what you are doing, it goes in so many different directions. You are studying that paper by MindQ. You are commenting on the Marshall-Walras divide. You are commenting on the formalization of economics. You speak about Bourbaki. You speak about the culture of economics. And fatally, you are very, very vague about all that, and you are your paper is full of sweeping assertions. And so this makes so at the end of the day, the reader asks himself, what's the content of the paper? What is he trying to pursue? There's more of that in your oral presentation now, but reading the paper, it goes in so many directions that really we are at a loss to understand what you are wanting to do. And so my suggestion is certainly that you need to narrow the paper, and probably also that you need something which is normal, to revise your initial intuitions and to make them more subtle, more nuanced. I have a lot of comments to make on your paper because it's rich, and so there are many things to say, and I have also many comments to make about what you say, for example, about the Walras-Marshall divide, or what you say about formalization, or that sort of the success of Walrasian theory, the dominance of Walrasian theory, which I would question. I believe, being the most prestigious field of economics in general, does not mean that it really dominates the field, that everybody is following the lines put by people like Arrow and Debreu. But I prefer to concentrate my discussion on the first section, on the MindQ paper, and to present to you and to the audience my own interpretation of the paper, which you will see is somewhat different from yours, although also we have some points of agreements. So and I will develop my discussion in 5 points. First point, of course, it's that MindQ's paper is very appealing. It's very appealing, writes very beautifully, and so he has a real touch of introducing new ideas, even if they are vague. But it is actually a very elusive paper, and especially one wonders what the engineering term really means. And glancing through the paper, I see that he says that engineers are problem solvers. They are not ready to buy rigor at any price. They are motivated by problems in the real world. They want to put theory in practice. They think that theory is fine as far as it's useful for policy making. They are ready and eager to leave the academic ivory tower. So this is still very vague, but what is not engineering is doing empirical work. So empirical, you can be an have said it should not be associated just with empirical work, as you may have suggested. So we don't know really what he means. And so that's, of course, the advantage of that type of paper is that people may put whatever meaning he likes to put, she likes to put on that. And so there may be a lot of ambiguities about that. That's the first point that I want to make about the paper. The second is that the paper has a consensual look. Mankiw tells us at the onset of the paper that the story is not of good guys and bad guys. Neither scientists nor engineers have a claim to greater virtue. Now, for my part, I see this as a smokescreen. I regard the paper as a plea rather than as a non-committed neutral assessment. And the standpoint defended by Mankiw is not that Keynesian is empirical, but that macroeconomics must follow Keynesian theory in being dual, in being at the same time theoretical and engineering. So, and what he is going to criticize is the viewpoint where people are only scientists and no longer engineers. So in his paper, there are good guys and bad guys. And the good guys, the bad guys, are modern macroeconomists. And this is very clear, but very clear at the end of the paper where he writes, modern macroeconomics may have been successful as a matter of science, but it hasn't contributed significantly on macroeconomic engineering. And that's the flaw. So Mankiw is taking sides in his paper, is distributing good marks, bad marks to the different episodes that have succeeded in the history of macro. And so his way of telling the history of macro is to say there are three stages. A first stage is Keynes general theory and Keynesian macro centered on the ISLM model. And these are the good guys. They are walking on their 2 feet. They are scientists and they are engineers. Then there is a second big episode, which he calls New Classical Program, and which he divides in 3 successive waves. The first, somewhat surprisingly, I return to that, is monetary. Monetary to him is good as well because he claims it is a good guy. There's a combination of science and engineering. Then everything changes with Lucas. With him, the bad guys come and all taking hold of the discipline. They may do good science, but they are really wanting from the engineering science. This is even more so for the third step in that New Classical Program, RBC model. They are really very bad according to Mankiw. Then the third stage is new classical, what he calls the new neoclassical synthesis, which is sometimes called DSG modeling, or which I would call second generation new Keynesian models. They are less off the mark than RBC, but nonetheless, they are on the wrong path. They are also they must also be indicted for having made the wrong choice of having ceased to be engineers. So that's the picture, and so that's the plea that Mankiw is doing. And so it is. This paper is an attack against Lucas, RBC, and the followers. Then another point, and this is my third point, which I believe is very important in this paper, is what Mankiw says about the neoclassical synthesis. He's a stern defender of the neoclassical synthesis. In his word, the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis is coherent, but it's also vague and incomplete. While the new classical economists responded to these defects by rejecting the synthesis and starting afresh, the new Keynesian economists thought that there was much to preserve. So they want to rehabilitate the neoclassical synthesis. Okay, but then what do we understand by the term neoclassical synthesis? It is often associated with ISLM modeling, but this cannot do because a synthesis implies that there are 2 partners. And so we have to identify the 2 elements, the 2 in the synthesis. And actually, Mankiw does that. He rightly refers to the Keynesian neoclassical synthesis. But still, this is a 2-way term. And this is where the Marshall-Walras divide starts cropping up in the discussion. Replace the term neoclassical with Walrasian, and then we have the Keynesian-Walras relationship. Notice that I don't any longer use the word synthesis. I use the word synthesis because there is a snag, namely a phenomenon where one word turns out to be used in a meaning that is exactly the opposite of its usual normal meaning. And that word is the word synthesis. So the claim of people like Mankiw is that basically it is fine to have a relationship of juxtaposition between Keynesian theory and Walrasian theory within the broader field of macroeconomics, without it being a synthesis, namely a piecing together of these two approaches. In other words, they claim, people like Mankiw claim, that both Keynesian and Walrasian theory have a right to existence as appropriate modeling strategies, even if it is admitted that no synthesis is possible between them. So what is at stake here is whether macroeconomics should adopt separate, it is okay for macroeconomics to adopt separate theoretical strategies according to the issues that are to be investigated. This is Mankiw's viewpoint. So synthesis for him is the acceptance of a pluralistic macroeconomics. And the division of territory of the macroeconomics then is as follows. Keynesian theory owns, as it were, the short period, where the economy is characterized with disequilibrium, sluggishness, and lack of market clearing, in particular involuntary employment. Because it is claimed it has the proper tool to address these occurrences. Keynesians, like Mankiw, admit that there exists another theoretical domain for which this time Walrasian theory is relevant, namely the long period, where prices are supposedly flexible and all markets experience market clearing. So defending the neoclassical theory amounts to argue that it is fine that macroeconomics is shared by these two different schools, each of them having their own object of analysis. Keynesian theory taking care of the short period, while Walrasian theory taking care of the long period. Now, the distinctive feature of the Lucasian revolution is to have claimed that Walrasian theory must rule over the whole domain of macroeconomics. And indeed, they were able to construct models from which the disequilibrium category, which is central to the Keynesian approach, is absent. So it's no longer needed. Thus, according to Lucas and his followers, is progress, because thereby macroeconomics becomes methodologically unified, because instead of being split and unification is viewed as a sign of progress in science. So this is the very state of affairs that to which Mankiw is totally opposed. So the Lucas-Kydland and Prescott line must be indicted for having extended the boundaries of Walrasian theory beyond its legitimate territory. I come to my fourth point. Nicholas is right in thinking that it's useful to read Mankiw's paper in the light of the Marshall-Walras divide. The modeling strategies that Mankiw approves of are indeed Marshallian, and those he finds flawed are Walrasian. I also follow Nicholas when he claims that the discussion would be clearer in the scientific, if the scientific engineering distinction were replaced with the Marshallian Walrasian one. And this move would give a better picture. For example, Mankiw defends the Keynesian model, new Keynesian modeling, as combining science and engineering. For my part, I don't see why and how. Why say manual cost or efficiency wage model deserve to be regarded as engineering, in that they give the economists some way of fixing a problem that is being brought out. So they are probably, I would see them as pure theory, as well as certainly as pure theory, more even than Kydland and Prescott, because they have no empirical counterpart. Definitely, they are neoclassical synthesis. They belong to neoclassical synthesis, but not to the club of good guys according to Mankiw's definition. Likewise, Mankiw is wrong in ranking Friedman among the good guys in terms of the engineering, non-engineering distinction. Friedman methodologically is totally different from Walras. He's not a Walrasian, and so he shouldn't be put in that category. Why does Mankiw do it? Probably because, in fact, in terms of the, well, because in fact, if Friedman is not on the pure theory side because he's doing empirical work, certainly he's definitely non-Walrasian. And that's the real criterion for attributing the label good guy or bad guy according to Mankiw. Finally, let me return to the central object of Nicolas' paper, the gap between macroeconomic theory and policy making. I don't deny its existence. It's also true that this gap has not always existed. In the heyday of Keynesian macroeconomic theory, bringing malfunctioning of the economy, such as aggregate demand deficiency or wage sluggishness, this theory had an immediate policy implication, demand activation. And governments were ready to follow macroeconomics advices. So there we had really a combination of theory and that engineering dimension, whatever it means. Actually, Mankiw's vision of economics as combining scientism and engineering fits the Keynesian vision of capitalism. Because according to this vision, capitalism is a fine system, except that it can experiment market failures. Fortunately enough for Keynesians, they believe that enlightened governments can remedy on such flaws. This view fits the image of an engineer or that of a plumber or that of a dentist, because fixing defects is the very action, the very job that one expects from them. By contrast, laissez-faire economists who believe in the self-regulating abilities of the market system are of the opinion that governmental interventions are counterproductive, creating more harm than help. Hence, they must refuse to play the engineering role. And so this explains why somebody like Friedman would certainly not accept the view of engineering with the connotation that he's fixing the problems in the system. No, the system is working on its own. Can it then be concluded that macroeconomics has evolved from defending a Keynesian vision of capitalism to be at the service of a laissez-faire vision? Well, this is true in one definite sense. The policy conclusion of modern macroeconomics, as it stands nowadays, support laissez-faire. But this cannot be the last word. Keynesian intervention in the economy were drawn from a theoretical corpus, which, according to present standards, must be judged as deeply wanting. Accepting that Keynesian policy have been working, at least to some point, it remains nonetheless a source of worry that they were based on poor theory, very badly, sloppy and methodologically wanting theory. So the Lucasian revolution must be regarded, as you have hinted at, as being mainly methodological, consisting of giving new standards for having a more serious, a more rigorous way of research practice, and giving, as you noticed, the priority to internal over external consistency. And this amounted, indeed, to make, somewhat surprisingly, macroeconomics part of the Walrasian paradigm. So it also amounted to starting the analysis with very abstract models, from which, by construction, any possible malfunctioning is excluded. Hence, the Panglossian characterization with which Keynes mocked his contemporary classical economic colleagues is now explicitly vindicated for the sake of consistency. While in Lucasian RBC DSG modeling policy, indeed conclusions support laissez-faire, this follows directly from the premises of the model. As a result, an epistemologically lucid defenders of this model must come to the view that the conclusions of the model shouldn't be peddled to policymakers, since they are just the effect of the premises of the model. What, and this in my book on the history of macro, I dubbed the non-exploitation principle. In other words, engineering is now a temptation that modern macroeconomics should forego, because it would be inept and it would be methodologically unacceptable. So that's a rather different viewpoint. So the turn that has taken place is a move from a stage where macroeconomics combines science, but sloppy science, with engineering, to where we have a more rigorous science, which is explicitly cut off from engineering in the sense of fiddling with the working of the system. So in that sense, MANQ assessment is right. Unlike what was the case before, present-day macroeconomics have no longer anything to say about policy making, at least in their quality of theories. They produce consistent models, but these are of almost no use for policy. Now, this is a void, and that void must be filled in. According to Dave Colander, the way in which this may happen is through economic policy, becoming a new autonomous subfield of economics, composed of people who do not produce theory, as macroeconomists did, earlier macroeconomists did, but consume it. That is, their job is to draw what they may find interesting from abstract macroeconomic modeling, mix this with what they learn from history, from law, from their knowledge of the working of government and central banks, and then using that in order to help governments to manage the economy. And this management would still proceed under the spell of the two main ideologies, Keynesianism and laissez-faire. So for the time being, and perhaps for long in the future, macroeconomists are no longer part of the policy-making fray. I don't say that this is a good evolution, but neither do I follow MANQ or Nicolas by asserting that it is a bad turn. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michel. So, Nicolas, I don't know if you want to comment further on that, and we can also receive questions from the rest of the audience if they have.
Well, first of all, thanks very much to Michael or to the Roy for the comments. And I think that he's totally right that as a young, maybe a South American student, I want to say a lot of stuff, not very well argued or not going so deep and so rigorous in this explanation. I think the reasons, as I said, the combination of being young and being not from the south of the world, of this Latin messy country. But I agree. Maybe I should reconsider all the claims and the topics that are there and go.
But there are many papers. There are many papers in your papers.
Yeah. I totally agree. I should pick maybe one topic and go very deep and analyze it in a much accurate way, and that I do it. I totally agree with that. This was maybe my main problem when I started the master. I wanted to say a lot of stuff, and my professor said, "But come on, man, stop. You need to first understand the concepts and to clarify them." And my mind go from this place. I try to say something accurate, but then when you are very, very accurate, you lose some relevance because you need to say much less stuff. So I'm in this world. I agree with that.
Okay. Well, if nobody has a question for now, I would like to make a comment. And I was wondering first if you have presented this paper to macroeconomists, to people who actually do macro, because I think
Which paper?
This paper from Nicolas. If you have discussed it with macroeconomists, because
no.
I think it would be interesting hear their responses.
No, but let me be very blunt here. See, if somebody like me, like an historian of economics, wants to have a conversation with macroeconomics, he must first, I would say, narrow the scope of what he's saying. And I believe that Nicolas' paper cannot be presented as it stands now to macroeconomists because it's too much, he goes into too many directions. So I'm not criticizing. I did the same when I'm beginning. And when you are a beginner, you are enthusiastic, but you must learn the discipline. And once that discipline could be done, and possibly someday, if Nicolas returned to Europe, we could work on that and writing a paper just on MindQ and trying to see whether we could agree on that. But even then, you see, I would say this is a more general remark. We, as historians of economics, we must find a window of our approach to macroeconomics which is of interest to them. And for example, you and your paper on Samuelson and central banks is something which may be of interest to macroeconomics. But that paper by MindQ, it shouldn't be taken in itself in that it is just one part of the disputes between New Keynesians and neoclassicals, and Lucas and company. So this I would say in my book I have chapters on that, and but they're carved in such a way that the discussion could start with macroeconomists. And well, I have received reactions from people, invitation to discuss it and so on. But I believe that that's the way in which we should proceed when discussing with macroeconomics. And Nicolas' paper is still into an inchoative way. It is a draft and it's normal. People must start with that. And then later on, they start with much sorrow, they start to say, I must drop this, I must drop this, and I must drop this. And then you have a paper that can be presented. This is a paper that it is useful to discuss within our community, but it's not yet okay for exportation, if I may say that very frankly.
Okay. I was wondering about that because I think, and what I have heard from some of the people that do macro here at my department, is that they don't think of themselves as mainly like scientists, because you actually nowadays you have a lot of DSGEs, very detailed applied DSG models about specific countries and specific problems. So it would be interesting to see if they actually see themselves in the story that MindQ tells.
Yes, but then the problem of MindQ's story that there is ambiguity between the engineer supposedly fixing the system and doing empirical work. And of course, these people do empirical work and they do very applied work. They do little theory, actually. Most of the researchers, you must be, they don't almost do no theory because they take just a very small perimeter and then they do computation, they do calibration and stuff like that. So they are mainly, so there is in the background, there is a theory. They must feed the theory. But what they are doing mainly is applied work and very boring work. And sometimes they are a bit fed up with it and they would like to have more theory, but they are not doing great theory. They are doing very applied work. And so in that sense, I would say they are engineers because they're doing computation, and engineers do computation. So in that sense, they would define themselves as engineers without being aware of, I would say, what MindQ has basically in mind is that engineers are plumbers who repair the system, and the system is in need of reparation.
Okay, I will give the word to Tiago because he has quite a long question.
Hello.
Hi, Tiago.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to read my question because, so I have taught with the MindQ paper, so that was a few years ago, so I can't say that my memory is flawless on this. But what I remember from it is that it was his reflection after serving in the Council of Economic Advisors. So it was his reflection of why ISLM was still being used by the Council of Economic Advisors many years after it become practically discredited in economics teaching. And what he explained was that the ISLM was still a powerful device to speak with policymakers. And in the case of the council, his job is to speak with the president and speak with Congress. So I wonder if the gap here is not in the minds of economists but in the relationship between economists and the lay, and in the communication of economics, and what can you convey with an earlier generation of models and the current generation of models, so that the gap is not methodological but communicative, something like that. That was my provocation. Now you can unmute me, please.
Nicolas or Michel
I
want to?
think that Michel is in a better position to answer.
Have you something to say, Nicolas?
No, I think that I'm not sure about that. I think that you are in a better position to answer this.
Okay. Well, Thiago, it has been a long time. So yeah, actually, I agree with you that there's a total gap of communication, and so it is interesting reading of Mankiw's paper, and well, I have no objections against it. So there's nothing provocative in what you are saying. It's true that ISLM model it conveys the gist of interdependency, and it's a fantastic tool not only for teaching macro, but it was well until I would say 2005. It was used by central banks as their main tools. And so surely somebody who has to convince political people, lay people, as you say, he probably has an interest in using the Keynes framework, although even, I would say it is the case also for people doing DSGF, for example, Frank Wouters, who wrote the Smets-Wouters model, is now an advisor of the governor of the central bank, and probably the question I'm asking is what can he do with this model to speak to these people? And so the evolution that took place in macroeconomics is an evolution where I would say what macroeconomists do is totally hermetic, not only even to lay people, but probably to many of you who are not macroeconomists. And so the barrier to entry is extraordinary. And it took me a long time because I wanted to know the theory from the inside, but it took me a long time for writing my book to know the theories from the inside. So that's a very difficult enterprise. And so that communication gap is really central, and you're totally right in saying it. Underlining it.
There was another question about if we can, what can we do to help resolve the gap between theory and practice?
This you may ask to Dave Colander, who is coming later, because this is his view that I would say that there will be people like Guttart, like De Grauw, and who are not really producing theory. That you're producing theory now is creating models, and just that, creating models, and especially doing empirical work or reproducibility and stuff like that. Then there would be other people who, well, as I hinted at the end, who must have some knowledge of the model, because I would say having a model is something interesting. And so having the ISL model in mind is interesting. Having the DSG model in mind is interesting as well. But so people must just have a knowledge of the basic insights, but then they will draw what they can deliver. They will draw it from history, especially when it comes to Great Recession. Their history is very important, or from institutional knowledge, or from their practice, or their knowledge having worked in central bank. But so it is possible, I don't know, but that there will be again an additional division of labor. And what was true of macroeconomics earlier, that there were experts in the science of advising governments, that they are no longer experts. And this is very visible nowadays. In the crisis, macroeconomists had little to say. And so I would say the people who intervened the most were either old Keynesians or people who have a more practical experience. And it's possible that this is the price, macroeconomists might say, this is the price to be paid for having doing something which is consistency. And Walras once wrote, I'm not planting salad, I'm planting oaks, trees that will grow in 2 centuries from now. And so if we do the hard line, it will take a lot of time. It's not that we believe that the system is not malfunctioning, but we believe, for better or worse, that one should start from something which is very rigorous and then introduce frictions, departures from that, and then arrive possibly at malfunctioning. And what is also present here is that tools are very important. Actually, the main way in which macroeconomics should evolve, the neoclassical macroeconomics should evolve, is trying to do multiple equilibria. And so the story would be that the economy is stuck in a suboptimal equilibrium. This was, for example, somebody who did that was Peter Diamond with his coconut model. Somebody who is trying to do that nowadays is Roger Farmer, who wrote several books recently about that. But there are technical problems. There are problems of how doing applied work. Well, macroeconomists really want to do applied work. And so the obstacles are theoretical. And so what macroeconomists do is probably saying priority to internal consistency. And we pay the price for that. We are no longer experts as macroeconomists used to be in the past. This may be a good choice. This can be a wrong choice. We will see later on. But, and I will just add, somebody, for example, like Prescott, who is saying that, which making the jump from his model to reality, that's totally wrong, of course. That's totally wrong. Other macroeconomists now must be very cautious and epistemologically alert to the limits of their models. And for example, saying, of course, we are unable to explain a great recession.
Okay, well, thank you, Michel. I think we pretty much ran out of time, although the next session is going to begin in
yes, that will be interesting as well, yes.
So we can make a very brief pause if you want.
Okay, perfect.
We can hang around for a couple of minutes.
At what time does it start, the second session?
It should start in 7 minutes, but okay. I don't see Professor Colander.
So we must enter into the list of participants then, or what becomes of my status? How can I follow I follow the discussion?
Well, when I think
I just stay online.
Yes, you just stay online.
Okay. Oh yes, my name is there among the participants. Perfect.
But if you want, you can stop sharing your webcam, Nicolas.
Okay. Yes, okay, I'll do that.
Okay, let me figure out how to.
But thanks very much.
So we should keep in touch, Nicolas. We should keep in touch because I have many comments on your paper.
Okay. I will write you an email. So.
Okay.
Oh, so everybody's here.
Oh.
So, hi, Emanuele and Professor Colander.
Hello.
How are you?
Hey, nice to meet you.
I'm trying to. Okay.
Hi, Dave.
Hello. Yeah, everything seems to be working fine. So.
Okay, that's great. So I'm going to make Emanuele the presenter. Okay, so right now, Emanuele, we are seeing your desktop. So when you start your presentation, when you make it full screen, you will not be able to see us, but we will be seeing and hearing you.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you.
So just to remind you guys, we have you have 20 minutes approximately, Emanuele, and then Professor Colander will have 15 to 20 minutes for his remarks, and then we will open the floor for questions from the public. But we can wait some 5 minutes before starting the presentation.
So tell me a bit about yourself, Emmanuel.
Yeah, first of all, very nice to meet you, Professor Kalander. I'm a
Only
research
Dave, please. I go back first now.
Okay, okay, that's fine. I'm a research assistant here at the University of Turin and at the Collegio Carlo Alberto, and I made my master, my MA in economics and complexity last year, and after that I started to be interested in how to compare Keynes's thought to complexity economics. And so I started to analyze how it could be done, that what if there is a sort of comparison I could do between these two kind of thought, because there were several papers that tried to compare their thought, and I said, okay, let's see to what extent I can say that maybe Keynes was a thinker of economic complexity, as a paper of a professor here said. And that's why I was interested in this stuff. And what I'm presenting today actually is this work about how we can, how long Keynes' thought is coterminous to complexity economics as developed at the Scientific Institute. And then I will also analyze a bit of Keynes' thought in this sense, so about what are the foundational, the epistemological foundation, methodological foundation of the complexity in Keynes' thought. That's gonna be my goal today in the presentation. And let me also say that I'm gonna I made a bit extension with respect to the paper that I made available, because I'm making research in this sense, and now we'll try to focus more on the last part of the paper, which is how we can compare these two different kind of thoughts in economics, and try to deal with this. Yeah.
Yeah, no. Interesting, sort of having fought for complexity for a long time,
Yeah.
but, sort of, again, there doesn't seem to be an enormous interest in the mainstream in sort of taking it into account.
Yeah, that's the problem also today, I think. Yeah, even though, we should be maybe more or less pluralistic, but this is a problem of the mainstream is interested or not. But maybe, to do some, to put some pressure also on them, it might be good in a sense.
So where are you thinking of publishing this? Or?
I'm working on this paper because I presented firstly in October in a conference here in Turin about the 80 years of the general theory. And the Fondazione Einaudi, which is the place where I presented this paper, they are would like to publish the paper on their journal. They have this academic journal, the Annals of the Fondazione Einaudi. And so it will go through a process of peer review, and then if it's good, they will publish it. And then I'm also made some extension with respect to the first paper. The first time I presented, there was John Davis who made the discussion of the paper, so I take some of his comments and try to develop also in that sense. And so if everything is going to be fine, it probably will appear on that review. Otherwise, I will make other works and see where it could be published in which journal.
And how long does your position at where you are now last? And then where is your plans?
Yeah, now I'm actually here in Turin, and next year, probably in September, I will go to the new school in New York to take another MA and then hopefully a PhD there. And since I apply also to a PhD this year, I made some research in this sense and some teaching in more orthodox economics, and at least that's what they asked me to do, and that's how I did. And right now, I'm working on this different aspect of complexity, Keynes. Then I'm also interested for example, financial complex system, and more from an applied point of view. From a theoretical perspective, I started to be interested in Keynes' thought when I wrote my first master thesis about a comparison between Keynes and Knight, the conception of risk, uncertainty, and probability. And then I realized that was maybe an interesting field. And then after the master in complexity, I said, okay, why not to try to compare Keynes and complexity? And so I take this challenge, and now I have to see whether I'm able to succeed on that or not.
Yeah, well, I think the new school will be interesting because Duncan Foley's there and Mark Setterfield. you know, both, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I've been in touch with them, and they told me that that would be interesting maybe for my also research interests. So they offer me this position as an MA. So I will take maybe also this other MA. Now I'm looking for funding actually, but yeah, if everything is going to be fine, yeah, hopefully I will be there from the end of August. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time, and I think we can start then. So Emanuele,
Sure.
you can start your presentation.
Yeah. Let me do this. Okay. Do you see also this part of the? Do you see the presentation? Is everything fine?
Yeah, we see everything.
Okay, that's perfect. So let me do. Okay, I'll move this here. Okay, so thank you for having me here to present this paper, which, and I said before, I try to extend it a bit in the sense I will develop most the second part of the paper, which is actually more related to the relation between Keynes and the complexity has developed at the Santa Fe and the so-called Santa Fe perspective. First of all, let me say that the first time I read some paper about complexity, I was impressed on how much definition of complexity there were. Indeed, a physicist, Seth Lloyd, that was a physicist at the MIT Institute, he realized there was 45 different definitions of complexity. But the interesting stuff is that in economics, the three definitions that are generally used do not belong to this list. And usually there is this definition of general complexity, more referred to Herbert Simon and Henderson, and the region of computational complexity, which is more referred in terms of the computation of an algorithm to represent the information of a system. And then we have this definition of dynamic complexity, that is what I will adopt, and which basically it works on dynamic system. And the reason why the definition that I put here from Day in 1994 is for two reasons. First of all, this seems to be the definition that better represent the vision of the Santa Fe Institute on complex adaptive system, and on the other hand is also the widest definition that is used from economists when they think in terms of complexity. So what I will do is to see in which way Keynes was a forerunner of the complexity, so what are the foundation of Keynes's complexity, and then I will move to see if in which sense we can find some complex dynamic in some aspect of the general theory. So let me start by Keynes's thought and say how we can speak about complexity. And actually, there are, if we go into the epistemological thought of Keynes, we are faced with two different positions, let's say, dichotomic position. The first is an organic approach to his thought, and the second one is an atomistic approach to his thought. I have to say that I will adopt the notion of organic interdependence in conceptualizing complexity in Keynes's thought. And the reason is that because I think that in this way we are able to deal what are the interdependencies that Keynes was looking for in economic theory and in the economy as well. And then we are able to realize them also not in terms of external relation, but internal relation between all the elements that builds up the economy and the economic system. So what I will do is to adopt an organic position as my epistemological point of view, which, for example, was developed by Carabelli in his paper about Keynes's method in 1988. What I would say about Keynes's complexity is this: according to Keynes, complexity represents a sort of problem which is due to the lack of a unit of measurement of what he called complex magnitude. In other words, what he thinks is that, in his opinion, this complex magnitude that, as I said in the paper, are, for instance, the probability, the utility, and some other, are intrinsically uncommensurable. That means basically that their lack of measurability does not depend on the epistemic, let's say, ability of the subject of the theorists, but on this magnitude themselves. And he said they are complex in the sense that they can vary more than one direction at the same time. So now we are faced, for example, in this quotation that I put it here, you can see how this choice of unit is said in the general theory. This is the general theory. So the choice of unit represents the problem of the economic system as a whole, and it was very concerned with find the choice of unit. So the problem of complexity, according to Keynes, is a problem of related to the philosophy of magnitude that could be investigated in his treatise on probability. Now, what we should ask is that if we are not able to measure this complex magnitude, how we could deal with that? And what Keynes offers us is basically this two-stage methodology, which is a methodology that allows to deal with organic complex systems. And in this methodology, in the first stage, what we are doing is to carry out a sort of analysis in which we take the complex material, we divide it in several parts, and then we applying the ceteris paribus assumption to the economic material, we work on this. Now, after this step, what we have to do is to go back on ourselves in the second stage and allow for what Keynes called the probable interaction of the factor amongst themselves, which means that in this way, actually, what we are going to do is to be able to study the whole complex material, understanding also what is organic nature. Because if we just stop at the first stage, what we are doing basically is to cap the nature of the complex material of the economic system as well. And what this means in another way is that by adopting this organic interdependence conception of Keynes' thought, we are able to deal with this sort of interdependencies that are actually very important, in my opinion, and represent the way how Keynes conceived the real world, which has to be carefully taken into account. However, what Keynes suggests is that in addition to this two-stage methodology, we have to use another tool, which is called the ordinary language, and which is opposed to the formalized language, which basically mean that according to Keynes, mathematical formalism is not able to deal with complex material, as it basically restricts its nature. Because Keynes has said that actually when you're dealing with complex material, what is important to understand the interconnection, and therefore if the material is organic, in order to penetrate this interconnectedness of organisms, we have to adopt this ordinary language logic, which of course is a difference with the formalized logic, which is the mathematical formalism that has its internal consistency and also is aimed to yield a sort of perfect knowledge. What Keynes said is that this ordinary language is not gonna provide a perfect knowledge, just a vague knowledge, but at least it helps us to deal with complex material. Now, this is in Pillow, what is the Keynes' view about the complexity and how complexity can be analyzed in his thought. Now, let me move to the part of the paper in which actually I try to see in which way we can say that we can establish a relation between Keynes and the Scientific Institute. And what I would say in this sense is to start from an analysis of which Schick carried out in 2004, and which said that the general theory is an open system and a complex system. An open system basically in which the relation of the parts themselves are not closed within the system itself, but also are connected to other systems. And in this way, if we look at the general theory, we should analyze on the one hand what is the relation between the micro and the macro structure that should not be taken as given. And this is also what Keynes was contrasting in his fallacy of composition. This two-dimension shouldn't apply the reductionist approach that orthodox economics did according to Keynes. His effort was to try to help the reader to not apply reductionist to complex material, to economic material. Otherwise, we are going to lose its nature. And the second point is the importance of the dimension of time, history, and path dependence in the general theory, which can help us to conceive it as a complex adaptive system. I should also say that the complexity of the general theory is also being analyzed in terms of its structure, of its language. For example, here I made these two references to Schick and Gotti. They call it an open-ended system because actually also the way Keynes expressed this idea are just full of flashback and flashes forward, if you want to borrow an expression from Chick, in his work, in the sense that if you read the general theory, you get the idea that he's making a sort of exercise in complexity, because actually go back and forth in every part, and for example, at the beginning explain you something, then at the second part explain you something else, and then at the end you go back to the beginning, and so basically it's very difficult to also understand his part. And this is also something that I deal with the paper. But I would like to concentrate more here on the role of expectation, which in my opinion could establish connection between the general theory and a complex system. In which sense I'm gonna say in this is that the expectation, according to Keynes, are first of all not formed in an individual way. Individual, when they create their expectation, they do according as other set of agents. Indeed, individual expectations are based on this shifting and unreliable evidence, which actually means that these individuals are acting in a context of fundamental uncertainty. And when we think of the animal spirit, they actually are not able to maximize their behavior in a sense. They do not carry out any optimizing process, because they actually act in the face of uncertainty. And what they have to do, they have to react. They have to imitate the other behavior. And in addition to this, Keynes himself declared that the nature of expectation takes into account of the time element. So basically, the expectation are related to the role of time. Let me analyze this more in detail. The relation between the micro and the macro structure, I said that should not be taken as given, in the sense that in a complex system it's always evolving, and we are trying to overcome the fallacy of composition. Indeed, as I said before, if we take into account these waves of irrational psychology that are at the basis of the conduct of the animal spirit, actually we can understand, in my opinion, that they do not act by maximizing, by just on a sort of a stimulus and response basis. But what they're doing more is they try to make sense in their world of what they do. They try to imitate other behavior and to react to changing conditions, because they're always changing. In this way, they act and they create a sort of network of expectation that resemble the John Holland's adaptive nonlinear network, and in which the one of the most important characteristics is that people and whole agents in this network, they react to changing circumstances. And this is what this animal spirit, according to their irrational behavior, are doing. The second thing that is very important in terms of expectation is the complex dynamics that they could actually give rise to, in the sense that if we take, for instance, the beauty contest, the famous beauty contest that Keynes talked about in the general theory in chapter 12, actually we see how this network of expectation could work, because here agents have to guess what is the average of other agents' opinion. So in itself, what we can say, following the analysis that John Davis carried out in one of his recent contributions, said actually that when we are dealing with this kind of beauty context, we have not only interdependencies within agents, because actually they try to imitate each other, and the opinion that they create on themselves is going to be based also on others' opinion. But they also showed some reflexive processes, because once I realize what the other are doing, I can change my mind about that. And in this way, we are creating a complex adaptive system which is continuously evolving itself. And in this way, the microstructures feedback on the microstructure, and in turn, it changes also the microstructure, because all these agents, they're going to think differently once they know what the other agents are thinking. And we can easily represent it on a network structure. And if we follow the analysis that, for example, two works by Arthur and other colleagues of him at the Santa Fe Institute, they actually discovered, they put in practice, Arthur, in the first of his paper, the Alpha-Rollbar problem in 1994, and the Santa Fe artificial stock market, we realized that actually we take these individuals and we assign them a sort of inductive rationality, so inductive decision-making process, not by using a common knowledge rationality as a starting point of the analysis. he realized how this evolving ecology, call it, of endogenous expectation emerged out of interaction. So in a sense, it seems to me that it validates what this analysis of Keynes in the beauty contest, in which we can think of this interaction that gives rise to complex dynamic and to positive feedback mechanism, which are important and which also bring to the further importance that even when individuals have rational expectation, if they interact, sometimes the results can be dynamically complex, even therefore in a context when they actually are maximizing their utility, they are optimizer, and they are conceived more in a traditional way having rational expectation. The second part is related to the path-dependence nature, to the role of time. I will here refer to this recent contribution by Carabelli and Cedrini, in which they analyzed the concept of Keynes about time, and they said that this conception of time is inseparable from the conception of change. In which sense? They said basically that Keynes was really concerned about the idea that time is continuously changes, and as it changes, it actually changes the relation in which the future and the past are related to each other, in the sense that basically if time is not just a simple spatial magnitude as we might conceive it in the neoclassical way, in which it brings the future back to the present, but if it's something which is evolving, then we are able to say that this evolving and this continuous adaptation of the system occurs because of the changes of time, or the continued changes of time. So if we put ourselves in this situation, we realize that time can actually occur and manifest itself through the influence of history. And this is interesting, what Victoria Cheek said about this, because we have a problem, of course, in the general theory of expectation that are said to be self-fulfilled, and therefore what this might prevent, in a sense, the path dependence. But if we analyze it more carefully, we might realize that according to the two-stage methodology that Keynes provides, in which basically what he was doing was, on the one hand, to analyze this complex material, just to divide it in several parts. And therefore, with this ceteris paribus assumption that I was also talking about at the beginning of the presentation, what is able to do is to take the whole economic system, analyze different parts, and extract some subsystem in which the expectations are considered to be fulfilled and time suspended. And in this way, it actually is able to take into account the path-dependent nature because of the second step of his analysis, which is when you go back to the original situation and it allows for the probable interaction with the different factors amongst themselves. So basically, this means that these partial and provisional closures that are introduced by Keynes do not prevent the economic material, the complex material, to lose its complex nature, because they have to be later removed. And then when they are removed, we are actually able to see how this theory could be path dependent. Now, from what this analysis might suggest, that is that the complex adaptive system and the theory of complexity economic that has been developed at the Scientific Institute might inherit this concept of Keynes, or at least we can establish a positive relation between these two different thoughts. However, I have to say something more with respect to the discrepancy that might occur in Keynes's in the analysis between these two different thoughts. And I would say that we have to take into account of the methodology for economics that Keynes and the Scientific Institute developed. Because when we are talking about Keynes's methodology, we should be very concerned that, first of all, is a non-positivistic methodology, which means that basically Keynes, according to him, the economics just does not furnish a body of settled conclusion. But what he has to do is to help the economists to not fall down in the reductionism that the orthodox theory did. Therefore, what he has to do is to actually provide an apparatus of mind according to which economists could act. And this is very important because Keynes said that the model, they have to be a logical nature. And this means that actually when you use a model, you can go directly from theory to practice. But what you have to do is to keep at the back of your head a meta model and then adapt it to specific circumstances. So Keynes' methodology was really concerned in giving this sort of framework to the economists within which to act and then to put it in practice according to the quesitum, let's say, if we want to borrow an expression also that Keynes used, of the specific circumstances. And this is actually, in my opinion, very important when we take into account of Keynes's thought. There is also another thing that, according to Keynes, economic is an art. I quoted here the quotation, which is economics is a science of thinking in terms of models, joins to the heart of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world. Which means that there is another important thing that we have to do, and is to take into account of the role of practical intuition and judgment of value, which is basically what also allows the economists to go from the first stage to the second stage, because we have to use the ordinary language logic that I was talking about before, but we have also to use this practical intuition that, and this is what makes economics into an art. This is another aspect that is very important in Keynes's thought. There is a huge body of literature which analyzes also this feature. And thirdly, I have to say that Keynes was against an excessive mathematical formalism. Not only mathematical formalism itself, because Keynes was also a mathematician, at least at the beginning of his career, but then he moved to economics. But as a mathematician, it does not deny the practical use of math. It just said that when the issues are complex, we have to abandon this formal logic and apply this ordinary language logic. Therefore, what is very important also in Keynes is the role of persuasion that had to be taken into account during his work. And this is, in my opinion, this called for an additional level of complexity, which is not of the material itself, but is the complexity between the object of the theory and the subject. That means between the economy itself and the economists that have to deal with that. This is, for instance, this interplay of theory and methodology in Keynes's thought that has been analyzed, for example, by Goethe, and called it reader involvement, in the sense that Keynes really has the reader to make this effort to understand this material. And therefore, I think there is this level of complexity that when we talk about Keynes's methodology from at least an epistemological point of view has to be taken into account. And in this respect, the methodology of the agent-based modeling which has been developed at the Santa Fe Institute and is probably the most well, let's say the most important, also the widespread in the economic practice, is based on mathematical formalism, in the sense that basically what this methodology is doing is to, being based on computer simulation, it could be casted in terms of a recursive function, which is, as Epstein here said, the mathematical formalism that is directly isomorphic to the computer programs, which means that, of course, we have to know how this math works, even though we are not directly dealing with, we are doing agent-based modeling with math. So this calls for two important facts. On the one hand, the fact that, as difference from Keynes, mathematics is important and as a non-dispensable role. And the other thing is that here there is another notion of complexity involved, which is that of computational complexity, which is, as I said, related to the to an algorithm, to his basically the time that he needs to analyze the information of a system. So let me go to the conclusion. I almost finished my time, and let me say that if I have to challenge the view of that Marchionati in 2010 in this article, Keynes is a thinker of economic complexity, puts forward, I would say that the relation between Keynes and the Santa Fe Institute could actually be taken into account if we analyze what are the pillars of Keynes's thought in terms of his of the concept of the general theory, in terms of expectation, for instance, of the concept of uncertainty, the concept of rationality and irrational behavior, and also his view of the economy, made his organic view in which actually we can't adopt the atomistic hypothesis to explain how the economy works. And this is, in my opinion, where we can establish a connection. But if we have to if I have to say where there are some discrepancies, I would say in the role of the math, so in the formalized language that Keynes actually opposed when it was excessive, and the role of art that economics has. For this reason, I would say that maybe it could be interesting to compare the Keynes's notion of complexity to what Delorme called deep complexity, which is this framework which involves not only the complexity of the object of the analysis, but also of the subject, so the process of our inquiry into the world and not only the property of the world. And this means, in conclusion, that if we take into account what the analysis of Keynes and the organic point of view, we have also a problem, which is, as Victoria Chico reminds us, is a problem of the paralysis of organisms. Because if we want to communicate results, we need to decompose the material we are analyzing. And Keynes, at the time, unfortunately, he had no available tool to deal with the simulation software, for instance, that it was not able to represent the complexity of the economy, also because of this lack of mathematical tool. Indeed, I quoted here this passage from Colander, in which, actually, in my opinion, he made this interesting point about how the possibility of the Keynesian revolution, that maybe at the beginning could have been a sort of complexity revolution, went actually into the neoclassical synthesis because of the impossibility of the mathematics and the mathematic technique available at the time to represent the system in a complex way. So what I'm saying at the end of this presentation is that if we want to give a sort of restore the validity of the general theory, which means to being able to create a sort of coherent research program within Keynes himself, which is able maybe to also contrast the more dominant neoclassical economy and the neoclassical synthesis, we should may think of Keynes' thought in terms of complexity, a complex system. Not too much from an epistemological point of view, because as I said, if we take into account the role of the economy and the role of theory and methodology that Keynes had in his mind, actually the Santa Fe Institute is not so interested in how to do economics, in my opinion, at least from to my knowledge. But it's more if we are taking into account how Keynes conceptualized the economy and the economic system. I think that to represent it and to reformulate within the theory of the complex adaptive system, it could help us to restore the validity of the general theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Then we have your comments, Professor Colander.
Yes. I don't know. I have some PowerPoints. Does it make sense to put them on or not? Or
okay, then I will make you the presenter so we can see your screen.
Okay. Are they there?
Not yet.
No. If not, I can go without them.
Yeah, I don't see them. You should have received a request to share your desktop.
I just got it. I accepted it, but I'm not sure. There we go.
Oh, there it is.
There. Is that showing?
Yes.
Good. I thought this was a really nice paper, not only because it agrees with much of what I had to say, but because I thought it was nicely written and sort of organized. That makes me a lousy discussant, however, because, you know, for the most part, I agree with just about everything that was said in it. So what I'll try and do is my best to sort of add sort of nuances to it. And I also thought what I try and do is provide some type of a context, really, about research strategies for young economists and how sort of papers can fit in with that. And then I thought after I finished that, I'd sort of discuss some of the variations of Keynesian complexity and how my particular views differ a little bit from theirs, but also agree with a lot of them. First, in terms of research strategies for young economists, I think the best way to think about any paper that you're writing is part of an ongoing debate. And you have to see you're taking part in this debate. And that means you've got to ask, who is your audience? Who is looking at it? And where is the debate taking place? You've got to picture this debate ongoing and over time sort of arriving at ideas. And I think you have to ask, what are you really trying to achieve with your paper? Are you trying to change someone's mind? And if so, whose mind are you trying to change? Are you trying to get a job? And if so, where? I know at American universities, you know, sort of where people do 3 essays now, always as opposed to a dissertation. One of the essays is a job paper, which is a different paper than the paper, their first publication paper. And I think thinking along those lines is really important. And if the goal is publication, the real question is, where am I publishing it? You know, so where is it going? What particular subpart of this debate is it going in? Within that, you have to ask, what's my long-run strategy? Where do I want to be in 5 to 10 years? And how is doing this paper and sort of me taking part in this debate going to affect that long-run strategy? And I think the answers to those questions determines whether it's a good paper or not, because it's whether it's fitting what you wanted to achieve in terms of your long-run goals, as opposed to, you know, sort of a particular one. Here, does the paper hold together? I think all papers, and this one holds together. And what I asked sort of before we started a little bit was really trying to get some background where, you know, sort of does really, you know, so this paper sort of move the strategy ahead for someone and thinking along those lines. So those are really my general thoughts on, you know, sort of overall some research strategies. But I think in talking about the paper and thinking of it, it's important for students to think that, as opposed to just, I'm getting the paper written. You know, sort of, and a lot of times I think that is a less useful strategy than trying to say, okay, where do I want to sort of focus my efforts and where do I not? And I say that in part because I think the audience for this paper can be a whole group of people. If it's that group of people who generally agree that complexity and Keynesian economics go together, you know, sort of, I'm almost in total agreement. I have very little to sort of add to that. But, you know, that means if I'm in almost total agreement, it's not changing the dial much. It's not sort of adding nuances to change something. That almost, if you're taking that part of the debate, what you want to go at is some of the places where I or somebody else might have said, here, they said this, but I think it should be that. Because that will change sort of the focus of what's there, as opposed to, you know, so here it is. In the paper, in the presentation, there was a little bit more of that than I thought there was in the paper, at least the version I saw, was early on, you know, sort of at the end of it, you know, sort of the goal was really, you know, thinking complexity, you know, that complexity is part of science, was much more in agreement. And the paper, as it was presented, sort of had, here's some places where I disagree. And that, I think, is more important if that's your audience. If your audience is a much broader audience that's looking at here people sort of trying to get insight into this whole overall issue, then I think, you know, sort of the paper is more along those lines. But a lot of times then you have to think, are they going to be interested in the particular way that I'm doing it? I've been pushing complexity for 40 years now, and quite honestly have not made lots of inroads in finding the mainstream is really interested. And as soon as one puts epistemology or some of the discussions there, you can see their eyes sort of covering over and them fading away from thinking about anything, you know, that's there. So 40 years of attempts to change macroeconomics to be seen as a complex system has been useful for me because it's led to lots of books and articles, but to be honest, has had little effect on the profession. And I think that's true of most of those who've added complexity interpretations of Keynes, Shackle, Davidson, Clower, Leyenhoff, and many others. And so the question is, this makes so much sense. Why is there no market for it in the mainstream? It isn't because the mainstream just has to stay in it on something. It's because the mainstream, in my view, is very focused on strategies of what will move them ahead and sort of thinking broadly about issues is not a strategy that fits into our current institutional structure of economics. And so I think that's important to sort of remember. Now, what that has led me to do is sort of focus more on, sort of how can I make these arguments in a way that mainstream economics will be more interested and more receptive to them. And that really forms the focus of my thinking as to how this, sort of can be presented and everything else. And I think, where I've come down is really that macroeconomics should be seen as engineering, not as science or even as applied science. Now, there's this connection where, sort of everything sort of talks about science. But I really have nothing to say about the methodology of science or science, because that's sort of trying to find the truth. And I think if you have a complex system, finding the truth is really, really difficult. And probably, sort of involves paths, which may involve discussing things that are totally irrelevant to any policy issues, such as dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. That could be science, but at the same time, one has a different vision of here's where it's going, and it just doesn't relate. The paper got at that and discussed it, so that's why, so it was very much within sort of the thinking that, I'm following. But really, sort of I emphasize much more that macroeconomics should be seen as engineering. Now, engineering does not see policy as following from science. It is not applied science. Theory in engineering is not sort of used here as a solution to something. Theory is used to provide insight into vision. So within engineering, policy follows from visions. Now, this is very close to the way in which, sort of the Keynesian method was presented. So Keynes, I argue, had a vision, a complexity vision. He certainly did not have a complexity science. As soon as we tried to say what he was doing was sort of changing the science and he was changing the paradigm, that undermined sort of the role that it could play. What he was doing was changing just here the heuristics of how to apply a vision that was shared widely, not, sort of classical economists didn't hold, oh, everything has to be in equilibrium. They knew it didn't, but they knew that their analytical structure could only handle equilibrium situations. So they did that and didn't expand much on that. They didn't talk much about sort of a theory of macroeconomics. It was just too difficult. So in some ways, the way Keynesian economics was presented as a science undermined its acceptance as sort of a complexity vision that had significant effects on engineering because of this sense that policy had to follow from theory, as opposed to policy follows from a vision overall. Theory is used to sort of highlight edges of the vision, where it's useful and not. So all usable macro models are essentially nothing but heuristics. And the question about heuristics is not, is it true? Is it logically, it should be logically correct. But, sort of, it doesn't have to be, so directly relevant. And the question is it relevant for the particular issue at hand? So you're not claiming sort of other things are wrong. All you're claiming is this is useful. That's a totally different debate than I think we've had in the past, and one that, so we should be heading to in economics. So complexity, in my view, has two dimensions that haven't been separated out. One is a complexity worldview. And I think all kinds of economists have a complexity worldview, going back to Adam Smith. The economy is a complex, evolving system of heterogeneous agents who interact in non-simple ways. Complexity science tries to get a specific theory about that interaction. Sort of creating a complexity science of economics or a complexity science of macroeconomics is extraordinarily difficult. And we are a long way from that. So therefore, those people who say this is a paradigm shift, I say, well, maybe, maybe not. It's beyond my pay grade. It's not something I can talk about because, science involves sort of a whole set of things, and paths that people have followed and are following a subpath. So the people working on DSGE models, so can totally believe that the economy is a complex system, but saying, what can I say about that? What can I do formally about that? Well, what I can do is straighten out the logic of this particular problem, which might help us in the long run, this 200-year horizon of von Ross, move us ahead. And so that's the science of complexity. And I don't think we're there yet, is to say complexity science should not be the new paradigm. So I don't talk about paradigms. But, so I do think we are at the point where complexity can have an enormous influence on policy. And I think if we see the general theory as saying complexity can have an enormous influence on policy and has relevance for it, it's the useful one, particular models, then it's much more useful and much more likely to be accepted. So the complexity worldview can be adopted right now, even if one has sort of the general equilibrium or DSGE model as your science, what the science is doing, because science doesn't have to lead to policy. Policy follows from a worldview and a vision that can be quite different from what you're working on. I remember, so we were interviewing a number of people, sort of about complexity and what effects it has. This was work I did with Rick Holt and Barthel Rosser. And we asked Ken Arrow, sort of what his view was, because Ken, of course, had sort of developed general equilibrium theory and was seen, here's this general equilibrium theorist. But at the same time, he's the person who sort of got behind Santa Fe and sort of organized and said this vision should be carried out and pushed it forward. And so we asked him, is this a contradiction? He said, no, not at all. Sort of here, you can have one worldview. Yes, it's a complex system, but what do we have to say about it? And wanting people to analytically work on that problem. It's a much more interesting problem, in my view, than adding sort of one additional element to a DSGE model, or trying to apply a DSGE model to real-world problems, because that model is so far from sort of the set of issues that we're interested in that it really, I just don't see high probability that it's there. But I see the same thing with ISLM. Useless in terms of really providing insight into sort of what the theory is, but possibly in cases very useful as a pedagogical model for teaching people, here's how monetary and fiscal policy might affect it in a certain way, as long as it's presented as a heuristic, not as here the theory that's there. And I think this blending of policy useful heuristics and theory has been at the forefront of where the problem comes in sort of discussing this with mainstream economists. And that's why most of the work I'm doing now has to do with really developing an engineering methodology of science, of economics, as opposed to an applied science methodology. And sort of engineers are quite willing to say, I don't care what the theory is. This seems to work. Here's my vision of things. Here's how they'll fit in. They'll fit in value judgments because they know that has to be part of it. So they separate sort of applied policy from theory in a quite different way. So I thought, sort of the emphasis, sort of in my work, I get into the difference between Marshall's approach, which, Keynes followed, and Robbins's approach, who I think followed the classical approach, which sort of separated out science and applied policy much more than Marshall did. And Marshall, in some ways, confused things because he tried to put them together. So economics is the science of thinking in terms of models joined by the art of choosing models, which are relevant to the contemporary world. I think that's right, but the art is really the art and craft. So economics is the art and craft of, choosing models, and, sort of, some of which may be the scientific models we're working on now. So science involves developing models, sort of, it's also what's changed now from when Keynes was talking was now statistical work and empirical work can play a much bigger role in science. because it really involves discovering patterns and deciding whether those patterns should be considered temporary and semi-permanent. And so the applied policy work I see in macro, totally consistent with the complexity view, is co-integrated vector autoregression. That data precedes theory at this point. And really, there's a lot of work, David Henry's work, I strongly encourage people to take a look at. Katerina Juzelius's work, sort of goes there. Sort of really sees it as a craft. Here, we're sort of applying the data, we have a general conception of the theory, and we're fitting the two together in a much more careful way than was possible previously. So that, I think, is sort of how I suggest sort of applied policy work is done. It really has little connection to theory, other than theory has to be used, because anytime you're doing empirical work, you have to make all kinds of assumptions, and your theoretical worldview affects those assumptions. You have to make that clear. There's a second type of macro that I think is applied engineering macro. And it relates the complexity vision to existing theories to see if you can come up with workable policies. And I think that's what Keynes did very much, that he was, an absolutely brilliant engineer, sort of seeing the way things fit. In terms of sort of pushing his views, he let people develop it in whatever way they would, because it sort of was part of the art of persuasion and how to get people to accept it. But I think overall, the best way to interpret Keynes is exactly the way that paper did, which is to see it as, sort of here, a way of sort of understanding things with sort of a downplay of theory. So, I very much agree overall with it. And so, sort of that's really what I have to say. So, turn it on. And other people?
Yeah, so Emmanuel, if you want to react, and the rest of the attendees can ask questions either on the chat box or they can tell me and I will let them speak out loud. So Emmanuel.
Yeah, I completely agree with David in the sense that I think that, as he said also in the chapter of the book I refer at the end of my presentation, it was taken from a book on the perspective on Keynesian economics. And David said actually that Keynes has understood this separation, first of all, between the theory and the policy, in the sense that what we have to do, and this is actually what Keynes said, we have to keep at the back of our head of a model, and then once we have this model, we can move to policy, but it's not straight the step. So in this sense, I completely agree, and I think that is something that should be really taken into account, and that maybe also Keynes understood the lesson also from Robinson, maybe rather than from Marshall, or at least more than Marshall did. I also completely agree with the fact that the paper itself was, I realized actually after I wrote the paper, but directed to a sort of audience that was more, let's say, expert and worked on Keynes from complexity perspective, and also from an epistemological point of view. So some author that also David was cited or other. And what I would like to do also right now that I'm working on the paper is to make it available to a different kind of audience that maybe not going too much into epistemological detail, because in the end, that's where I think that the vision of complexity that I explain in the paper might diverge with respect to Keynes, but more from the point of view of this vision of the world, as a complex vision of the world that could be represented maybe in terms of the complex adaptive system. So I'm also working on this side of the paper, because I think it's the best thing, maybe also in terms of how to write an article that David said at the beginning. Maybe it's going to be more interesting, both for also the readers and also for me that I'm working on this stuff, maybe just to, rather than to restrict it to an epistemological framework where maybe it's much more difficult also to try to establish a sort of dialogue with the mainstream. Yeah, so that is what I think about the comment, and then I completely agree.
Oh, we both agree.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. Sorry, Juan, I can't hear you.
Oh yeah, it's my fault. I was muted.
Yeah.
So
No, it's fine.
I wanted to ask one question, Emmanuel, because when I've heard some people in my department talk about complexity economics, and what they don't like is that they see that sort of as a black box. So they don't see that as a tractable enough way of looking at words. So when they are looking at agent-based modeling, they don't like it because they feel like it is not tractable, right? But on the other hand, when I was reading your description of Keynes' view of like the subject matter is complex, so we cannot use math in the way that we have actually that we ended up using it, it does become quite hard to sort of communicate an idea because you risk people not understanding exactly what you want to say because you are probably missing on the priors that that person has and the way that he's looking at the world. And in that sense, I do think that even if people now think that agent-based modeling is perhaps intractable, I would say that it is an advance regarding what we had in the 30s and 40s. So it is a quite flexible tool to present and communicate ideas. So in that regard, I think it's an advance on the type of procedure that Keynes was proposing.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. No. Take first. No problem.
Okay, I totally agree. So with the commenter, I present complexity economics not as sort of something different, but just sort of the natural evolution of science. When you have new tools, you use them. So when they were working on Keynes's work, it was obvious, or it should have been obvious, that nonlinear dynamics were really important for that. But the math to do nonlinear dynamics then did not exist. It really was way beyond where most economists were. Goodwin was probably the only economist who really sort of tried to specify it, and his interpretation of Keynes never really caught on because the math was too great. The mathematicians got annihilated at that time. They couldn't sort of get anything published. Because yes, it had wonderful insights, but it was way beyond their audience that went on. So as sort of the sophistication of economists has improved, so you can now move and create and use nonlinear dynamics in a much greater extent. So part of complexity is simply moving from linear dynamics to nonlinear dynamic models, and sort of capturing a whole set of things that the other models couldn't do. You also have new tools, agent-based modeling, for capturing interrelationships among heterodox individuals that you didn't have before. And this is not a separate science from anything. It's just saying, use the latest technology that you can. Why sort of stick with old stuff when you can do new stuff? It isn't against math or in favor of math. It's just saying, here's a tool, let's use it. I think Lee Tesfatsion's work is sort of the nicest sort of discussion of here's the way you can use it. It isn't surprising to me that she's really an engineer and teaching at an engineering school. Because she uses agent-based model as an engineering approach to particular problems. It doesn't answer everything. It provides useful insight into particular things. And the third dimension that's really changed is computational data science. So really being able now to sort of use co-integrated vector autoregression, finding deep patterns, artificial, sort of intelligence sort of really operating there. Discovering things, sort of with the computer that you couldn't possibly think of before. And that's why I've always compared it to sort of Wolfson's new type of science that is using the computer in ways that it isn't. So it isn't that here, this is some enormous step away from, standard science. It's just standard science moving ahead as we have new technology coming. So that's my overall view. And my answer that I give to mainstream economists, they say, what's this complexity? Complexity is nothing but standard economics. It's actually the best of cutting edge standard economics.
There are a couple of questions. I don't know if you can see them in the chat box.
No, I'm not seeing the chat box. Sorry.
So there's one by Nicolas, and he says that Colander says macroeconomics should be seen as engineering, not science or applied science. So heuristics rather than theories. And his question is, which is then the relationship between theory and policy making?
For me, theory might be useful in sort of thinking about policy and giving you insight into it. But sort of you can have hundreds of different theories. One will be the one in which sort of the economists are working on at this time. You also have 6 or 7 other theories that people are working on that aren't quite up to the science or that, but which might be useful. You use all of those combined in common sense to arrive at policy. So policy does not depend on theory at all. Theory is used to supplement insights that you might have and see that you don't make logical mistakes.
And there's another one by Tiago Mata. He's asking, how is the new generation of machine learning and deep AI a challenge to complexity economics built from complexity physics, that is nonlinear dynamics of the 1980s? And I would like to add that I'm also curious about this, because one thing that I have noticed is that all of the people doing consulting for like standard economic consulting are now offering like machine learning among their services. So it seems that it has been a very attractive and very successful new technology, which has not been the case, for example, of standard nonlinear dynamics or agent-based modeling. I don't see any economics consulting firm offering agent-based modeling.
There actually are, agent-based modeling is used quite a bit around, and they bring in people. I don't know whether there's consulting firms, I assume there are. A lot of people who do agent-based modeling get lots of calls to go in and sort of solve particular problems that you're trying to. Lee Tesfazion talked about one, sort of Disney World had this problem of queues and where people line up. And, so they solved it with agent-based models that go on. Epstein talks about how agent-based modeling is the go-to sort of modeling structure in epidemiology. So in particular areas where it's been useful, it's there. It's there. In the same way, sort of data science is there. Data science now develops because of sort of the ability to run computers. And what it means is, as sort of computers can simulate things and sort of create different ways and sort of put things in, value of theory goes down. Value of patterns discovered through empirical work goes up. So it's like we're getting a different way of envisioning sort of systems that are going on. And there's going to be bits and pieces of all those. But I don't see these as separate from standard economics at all. I see it as really just a movement with the new technology that's existed.
I think that's very interesting, because so part of my work, what I'm trying to understand is those big macroeconometric models of the 60s and 70s, they eventually got out of fashion in academia, but there were a lot of people that kept working on those models in the private sector, for example. So
I don't think that's right. I think private sector gave up the models long before the academia did.
In the 60s and 70s?
Yeah. But in other words, the econometric models within business were used to cover your ass. Essentially, you wanted to be able to say, I've used the best model available. The business people didn't really believe it or anything else. And sort of the models, the banks sort of got rid of economists when they started to say, you have to pay your own way. You have to find somebody within the bank who's willing to pay. And that's when most of the economists at banks became talking heads, sort of who talked to clients, who met with clients and that. But, sort of the big, where they were using these econometric models sort of faded away much faster than, the Fed model. There's still an econometric model at the Fed. Sort of the other models people were working in the 70s on LINC, I remember, which was going to be this global econometric model. This was extending sort of the theory way beyond what it could be doing, and sort of giving people false sort of sense of security, because it was based upon some variation on ISLM, which already sort of lost the nonlinear dynamics that you needed. So my own view is, that sort of really business gave up on the models because they're worried about it. What do they have to say? Now, where they kept the models was how, once it breaks up, will it affect my sub-part of an industry? And that's the one part, sort of that they sort of kept. But it was only that aspect as opposed to really sort of saying we're predicting what's going on with the economy. Anybody doing predictions of the economy now uses VAR. Sort of that's, it's so easy to run and everything else. And if you're trying to sort of figure out long-term versus short-term, you do co-integrated vector autoregression where you have sufficient data to operate there. And it's been surprising to me, David Henry has really nice discussions of this, how little of that is known about in the US, and it's much more European.
It's interesting that it would seem, it's odd then that if you have people successfully implementing these new technologies in the private sector, that means that they work, that they do their job. It should be an incentive for people in academia to pay more attention to them, right?
Academia doesn't get their pay from, sort of, very few of us get pay from consulting. If we did, there'd be changes in the way the system works. Academia gets advances by publishing. And you have to understand the set of incentives sort of driving people to understand what goes on. As soon as people start consulting and say, here's what we're doing, then they'll use a quite different set of models and structure and argument than they would if they're sort of working, preparing for publication in the paper, in a journal.
So I don't know if anybody else has more comments or questions. We still have a couple more minutes. Okay, then I think that we can end this here. Thank you very much to Emanuela, and thank you very much to Professor Collander for attending this. And I hope we'll see you soon sometime.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you. Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you.